the IS-2 tank. This machine was built in roofless workshops during the brutal Ural winter. The people behind it slept only 4 hours a day, and one of its chief designers was temporarily removed from his position right in the middle of development. Behind this tank lies a story rarely spoken about openly, a story of failures, defects, and early production models that fell far short of what had been promised on paper. And yet this was the machine that forced Germany's greatest tank ace to publicly admit he was afraid of it. This tank traveled from the factories of the Urals all the way to the center of Berlin. And when it appeared at the 1945 Victory Parade, it caused something among the Allies they preferred not to discuss: a quiet, cold sense of trevogha. Today we'll tell the full story: how this machine was born, what crises it survived, what happened inside a knocked-out crew compartment, and why some tankers asked to be transferred back to the T-34. Why did Stalin personally interfere in its fate? And what exactly did he say when he saw the result? Subscribe so you don't miss future videos about legendary military vehicles and weapons. Let's begin. July 1943. Soviet tank crews inside their T-34s looked through their sights and saw something they had never truly been prepared for. Low, angular silhouettes with long gun barrels slowly advanced from the German positions. Tigers, Panthers, machines against which the old methods of combat simply no longer worked. During the Battle of Kursk, nearly 2 million soldiers and over 6,000 tanks clashed. But the real issue wasn't just numbers, it was range. The German Tiger could confidently destroy Soviet tanks from 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, at distances where Soviet shells no longer had enough force to penetrate armor. T-34 crews received strict instructions: avoid direct duels, maneuver constantly, get within 500 meters, and strike the Tiger's sides or tracks. But on the open steppe, that was easier to write in an order than to carry out under fire. By the end of the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army had lost more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Later, Wehrmacht General Friedrich von Mellenthin would write with undisguised astonishment, "Our tank divisions, which had been in such excellent condition at the start of the battle, were now completely drained." The Germans had suffered losses too, but the main result of the battle was something else entirely. Soviet command finally saw the enormous gap between what they had and what they needed. The KV heavy tanks, which at the beginning of the war had seemed nearly invulnerable, had completely lost that reputation by 1943. Their unreliable transmissions failed more often than German shells penetrated their armor. Near Leningrad in 1943, just 3 Tigers destroyed an entire group of KV-1s, not in close combat, but by firing from distances where Soviet guns were powerless. The lighter KV-1S version solved nothing. It became faster, but not stronger. The Soviet military industry now faced a brutal choice: continue producing thousands of tanks that burned under German fire at visible range, or create an entirely new machine, one capable of looking a tiger in the eye and not blinking. A tank that could begin a duel first and win it. It was after Kursk that Soviet leadership made the decision that would change the course of the war. Production of light tanks was halted. Factories received new orders, and somewhere deep inside the workshops of the Urals, where the best minds of the evacuated Kirov plant had gathered, work began on a machine that did not yet have a name, but soon would receive one. A name whose very sound would later force German tank crews to change the routes of their columns. Autumn 1941. While German armies pushed toward Moscow and tightened the blockade around Leningrad, hundreds of railway convoys moved eastward. Inside freight cars were machine tools, presses, blueprints, and people. The Kirov plant, the largest tank factory in the Soviet Union, was dismantled under artillery fire and evacuated piece by piece. The workers left last. Some were flown out of the besieged city by aircraft. They carried more than equipment. They carried knowledge without which metal could never become a weapon. Their destination was Chelyabinsk. Here, on the foundation of a tractor factory, the evacuated facilities of several industrial plants were merged into one giant complex. Workers were housed in hastily built barracks. Machines were installed directly under the open sky and started before roofs could even be constructed above them. And just weeks after the trains arrived, the factory was already producing tanks. The city received an unofficial name that would enter history forever: Tankograd, Tank City. At the head of the design bureau stood Joseph Kotin, a man who was not even 40 years old when the war began. He had become chief designer of the Kirov plant's tank bureau at just 29, an age when most engineers were only beginning to gain experience. Under his leadership, the KV heavy tanks had been created, machines that in 1941 inspired almost mystical fear among German troops. But time passed, the enemy adapted, and the KV was no longer a monster. Now Kotin had to start over and create something greater. During the war years, Tankograd would produce more than 18,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. But that came later. In 1943, the factory stood at a crossroads. Production lines that once built heavy KV tanks were gradually being converted for T-34 production, and even the leadership wasn't certain whether the Kirov plant would ever return to heavy vehicles again. The industrial rear of the Urals was operating beyond exhaustion. People slept 4 hours a day, while the State Defense Committee demanded not concepts or blueprints, but steel and deadlines. And then the task was set. Not simply a new tank. A tank superior to everything Germany had already thrown onto the battlefield, and everything it was preparing to unleash next. Kotin took a blank sheet of paper. But before drawing the first line of the new project, one question had to be solved first. A question capable of killing the entire idea before it even began. What weapon would this tank carry? The issue of armament became perhaps the most difficult problem of all. Not armor, not the engine, the gun. Because armor could always be thickened. An engine could be upgraded. But a cannon either penetrated a Tiger or it didn't. There was no third option. By 1943, Soviet engineers had already explored several alternatives, and every one of them hit a dead end. Production of 107mm guns, once considered promising before the war, had effectively ceased. The 100mm naval anti-aircraft gun was still too crude for armored vehicles, and adapting it would take until late 1944. Only one realistic solution remained: the 122mm caliber. The idea did not come from a Stabnoi cabinet. Early in 1943, Soviet forces tested a captured Tiger tank by firing different weapons at it. The very first hit from the 122mm A-19 gun at a range of 1.5 kilometers tore the turret clean off the German tank. The conclusion was obvious. Only one question remained: how do you fit such a weapon into a tank? In May 1943, even before the Battle of Kursk had ended, the Design Bureau of Factory No. 9, led by Fyodor Petrov, began independently developing a 122mm tank gun based on the ballistics of the A-19. By mid-July, the first draft project for mounting the weapon inside the IS turret was complete. Kotin personally coordinated the decision with Joseph Stalin and received approval. That was how the D-25T gun was born. In sheer firepower, it far surpassed the famous German 88mm gun, mounted on the Tiger. The 122mm shell weighed 25 kilograms and carried 3 times more explosive filler than its German counterpart. At a range of 1.5 kilometers, it could penetrate up to 130 millimeters of armor at a direct angle, exactly enough to ensure that the Tiger was no longer invulnerable. Later, Soviet military reports would state the 122mm gun ensured destruction of enemy armored targets at ranges up to 2.5 kilometers. But the D-25T had one serious weakness: low rate of fire. Separate loading ammunition meant that the crew needed around 27 seconds between shots. The ammunition load dropped to only 28 shells. It was a deliberate compromise, not rate of fire, but the power of every individual strike. Not a machine gun burst, but the blow of a sledgehammer. In autumn 1943, testing of Object 240 was completed. A report sent to Stalin'S stated briefly and directly, "The new tank is capable of destroying the heaviest German vehicles at distances from 1.5 to 2 kilometers." On October 31, 1943, the State Defense Committee signed the order. The tank received a name, the name of the leader himself. Only one task remained now: put it into production. And that was where the real difficulties began. December 1943. Beyond the gates of the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant lay the brutal Ural winter, endless darkness, and the roar of workshops that never stopped operating day or night. It was here, at the end of the first wartime December, that the first 35 serial production IS-2 tanks rolled out. The machines were finished, but they were not truly ready yet. The problem lay in the gun itself. Because of wartime shortages, Factory Number 9 initially delivered guns fitted with outdated screw-type breeches, a design typical for artillery, not armored fighting vehicles. This reduced the rate of fire and made the loader's job inside the cramped fighting compartment even harder. The semi-automatic wedge breech, standard for tanks of this class, appeared later during mass production. Until then, the vehicles went to the front with whatever equipment was available. At the same time, engineers continued improving the hull design. Early IS-2 tanks of the 1943 model had a distinctive stepped-cast front hull, with armor thickness varying from 60 to 120 millimeters across different sections. Beginning in 1944, Uralmash switched to producing hulls with a straightened welded front plate. It was technologically simpler, and the armor protection was better. Each new production series became slightly superior to the previous one. The project was evolving live, in motion, while the war itself continued around it. Achieving proper quality control proved harder than organizing production itself. At first, military inspectors rejected a significant number of vehicles. The relentless pace, exhausted workers, and overloaded factories all took their toll. The situation became so serious that Joseph Cotten was temporarily removed from leadership of the Design Bureau. Only by the summer of 1944, when roughly one-third of the tanks finally began passing inspection on the first attempt, did things start moving forward again. By November, production quality was officially declared satisfactory, and Cotten returned to his position. Meanwhile, the factory continued increasing output: 35 tanks in December, another 35 in January. Then, the numbers began climbing rapidly. The V2K engine, producing 600 horsepower, pushed the 46-ton vehicle to speeds of up to 37 kilometers per hour, faster than many expected from a machine of its size. The new planetary steering mechanisms, which replaced the hated transmission system of the KV tanks, made the IS-2 surprisingly maneuverable for a heavy tank. Tankers who transferred from KV vehicles often said, "This machine responds to your hands." By May 1945, the factory had produced a total of 3,395 IS-2 tanks. Every single one was the result of night shifts, arguments over blueprints, welding sparks, and increasingly strict factory inspections. The tank was being developed literally during combat itself. While the first machines fought at the front, engineers back in Chelyabinsk were already correcting their flaws in the next production series. By spring 1944, the IS-2 was finally ready, in the only sense that mattered during wartime. Ready not for exercises, ready to meet the Tiger. And that meeting came quickly. March 1944, Ukraine. The first IS-2 tanks moved into starting positions during the Proskurov-Chernovtsi offensive. For most Soviet crews, it was their first battle in the new machines. For German gunners, it was the first encounter with an enemy against which their famous 88mm gun was no longer a guaranteed advantage. German command reacted immediately. An official order distributed among Wehrmacht units stated directly, "Tigers are not to engage IS-2 tanks at distances closer than 1 kilometer. Not closer than 1 kilometer. That meant the German tanker had to destroy the enemy with the very first shot from maximum range. Miss once, and the Tiger entered the kill zone of the Soviet 122mm cannon. German calculations showed that the IS-2 could penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor from 2.5 kilometers, distances at which German guns often could not effectively respond at all. Theoretical superiority quickly proved itself in battle. On March 4, 1944, the 1st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment encountered a company of Tigers from the German 500th Heavy Tank Battalion near Starokonstantinov. Soviet crews acted according to tactics that were already becoming standard for the IS-2. They occupied positions behind terrain folds, inside tree lines, and behind buildings. They waited patiently and fired first from ranges where German guns remained far less effective. With the very first shot, Lieutenant Maximov's unit turned a Tiger into a burning wreck. In just 20 minutes of combat, 4 IS-2 tanks disabled 7 German heavy tanks without losing a single vehicle themselves. German tank crews, once accustomed to dominating long-range combat, suddenly found themselves in an unfamiliar role. Tank ace Otto Carius, who fought in Tigers throughout the Eastern Front, later called the IS-2 the most dangerous Soviet vehicle for Tiger crews, even more dangerous than the T-34, which German forces had already learned how to fight. That was not propaganda. It was the professional judgment of a man whose life depended on the answer. Still, the IS-2 had one real tactical weakness: low rate of fire. If the first shot missed, the Tiger, capable of firing 6 to 8 rounds per minute, could react before the Soviet loader managed to chamber the next shell. That is why IS-2 tactics revolved around one principle: strike first, strike accurately. Ambushes, flanking attacks, fire from carefully prepared positions. All of it existed to compensate for what could not be changed in the design itself. By 1944, it had become obvious. In open terrain, the IS-2 had shifted the balance of power. But another type of battlefield awaited ahead, one completely different from the wide plains of Ukraine. Cities, streets, alleys, apartment blocks, narrow intersections where combat distances collapsed to 20 meters. And here, the tank named after Joseph Stalin would have to prove that it was not merely a long-range dueling machine, but the ultimate assault tank. If the IS-2 ruled at long range in open terrain, cities changed every rule. A street was not a step. A tank could emerge from behind a corner and instantly enter a kill zone. Combat distances shrank to 20 meters, 10 meters, sometimes no more than the length of an arm holding a Panzerfaust from a basement window. By 1944 to 1945, Soviet crews were fighting in Budapest, Vienna, and Poznan, and in every city they had to relearn warfare from scratch. The greatest threat was no longer the Tiger. It was the German infantryman carrying a handheld anti-tank launcher. In urban battles, Panzerfaust weapons accounted for up to 70% of all destroyed Soviet tanks. An IS-2 crew that had survived duels with Tigers in Ukraine could still die to a teenage member of the Hitler Youth hiding inside a Berlin apartment building. Soviet command developed an answer, the so-called Christmas tree tactic. Two IS-2 tanks advanced in staggered formation on opposite sides of a street. One covered the right side, the other the left. A second pair followed behind, protecting the first. Each tank was assigned a platoon of submachine gunners, 5 infantry squads riding on the armor and dismounting at the slightest movement in windows or doorways. Their mission was simple: eliminate Panzerfaust operators before they could aim. Armor without infantry in a city was blind. Infantry without armor was defenseless. Only together could they become an assault force powerful enough that Berlin itself could not stop them. In urban combat, the 122mm gun revealed an entirely unexpected role. It had been designed as an anti-tank weapon, but inside cities it became a universal instrument of destruction. A single shell could obliterate barricades made of cobblestones and overturned tram cars. Fortified buildings firing on Soviet troops ceased to exist as defensive positions after just 2 or 3 hits. During the assault on Berlin, Soviet artillery and tanks smashed entire city blocks apart, carving paths for infantry through mountains of rubble. Beginning in 1944, IS tanks were equipped with DSHK anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on the turret. These heavy machine guns cut down enemy infantry hiding on upper floors and inside shattered walls, places the main cannon could not reach. Whenever possible, Soviet commanders tried to avoid completely destroying historic cities. It is known that during the approach to Lviv, a deliberate decision was made to capture the city using tanks instead of heavy aerial bombardment in order to preserve its architectural beauty. Joseph Stalin reportedly called the IS-2 the tank of victory and said, "With this machine, we will finish the war." April 1945 proved he was right. On April 26, 1945, Soviet forces entered the center of Berlin. Among them were heavy tank brigades equipped with IS-2s, 65 vehicles in each brigade. The Reichstag, the Imperial Chancellery, the last defensive strongholds of Nazi Germany. All of them collapsed beneath the fire of guns that had not even existed a year and a half earlier. The war was ending, but engineers in Chelyabinsk were already thinking about what would come next. Because in August 1944, while IS-2 tanks were assaulting Warsaw, one designer took a blank sheet of paper and began sketching something fundamentally new. While the IS-2 stormed European cities, the design bureau in Chelyabinsk was already working on its successor. Not because the IS-2 had become obsolete, but because war never forgave stagnation. Engineer Mikhail Balzi, an associate of chief designer Nikolai Dukov, identified a vulnerability that had become critical in urban warfare. The gap between the IS-2's turret and hull was wide enough for a Panzerfaust grenade to enter, and once that happened, even thick armor could not save the crew. A fundamentally new turret was needed. Balzi designed one. Work on the Kirovets one began in 1944 simultaneously at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, an experimental factory number 100. The requirement, personally approved by Stalin in December of that year, was brutally clear: armor that an 88mm German gun could not penetrate from any frontal angle up to 60 degrees. The solution became the famous pike nose design, a sharply angled wedge-shaped front hull that caused incoming shells to ricochet instead of transferring their destructive force into the armor. A new hemispherical turret without vertical surfaces completed the concept. Shells truly bounced off it. On March 29, 1945, the IS-3 was officially accepted into service. The first production vehicles rolled off the assembly line in May, after the final shots in Berlin had already been fired. The tank did not arrive in time for the war itself, but the war still gave it a stage. On September 7, 1945, a victory parade of Allied forces took place near the Brandenburg Gate. A column of IS-3 tanks closed the Soviet section of the parade. When these machines appeared before the reviewing stands occupied by American, British, and French officers, something close to confusion spread through the Allied ranks. Nothing comparable existed in their armies at that moment. The Soviet Union, having just survived and won the most devastating war in its history, was demonstrating something important to the world. It had not merely recovered, it had moved ahead. Production of the IS-2 itself was rapidly phased out, exactly the way Soviet industry often operated, but the tanks themselves did not disappear. During the 1960s, the remaining IS-2s underwent major modernization. Their hull bottoms were reinforced, many components were standardized with newer heavy tanks, and some vehicles received night vision equipment. In the nuclear age, they found a new role: fortified defensive positions. A 46-ton machine, armed with a 122mm gun, became a stationary, but extremely unpleasant, argument in any defensive line. Formally, the IS-2 remained in Russian military service until 1995. Half a century after the war, it helped finish. During those decades, the tank also fought in several post-war conflicts in the hands of Soviet allies around the world. Its descendants, the IS-3, IS-4, and T-10, served even longer, continuing the idea's firstborn inside Object 240 back in October 1943. Today, IS-2 tanks stand on pedestals across the former Soviet Union, frozen in place, painted green, still facing the direction from which the enemy once came. These machines were created under inhuman conditions, during winter, inside roofless Ural factories, by people sleeping only in short bursts, fully aware that every single tank mattered. They did not want to impress the world with weapons. They wanted to win and return home.